He was born in a village of mud and dust, beneath a sky that knew no mercy. No one sang when he arrived, and no hand reached to bless him. They named him Saddam, the one who confronts. Long before the world feared his name, the boy who would become a tyrant learned one truth: to survive, you must strike first. The river Tigris bends through the dust of northern Iraq, like a vein of dull silver. On its western bank lies a cluster of mud brick houses, half sunk in heat and silence. This is Al-Awiyah, a village that seems carved from the earth itself. Goats bleat among cracked courtyards. The sun burns without mercy. And on an April morning in 1937, a child is born into that parched world, a boy who will one day drench it in fear. His name is Saddam. In Arabic, it means the one who confronts the stubborn one. It is a name his mother gave not out of pride, but out of pain. Suba, the woman who bore him, had already lost too much. Her husband vanished before the child was born, swallowed by rumor, perhaps by death. Soon after, her 12-year-old son died of cancer. Grief hollowed her out, left her unable to face the days. It is said she tried to end her own life, and the life still stirring inside her. But fate refused her that mercy. When the baby came, she looked upon him not with joy, but with exhaustion, as if life itself had forced a cruel joke upon her. Still, she named him Saddam. Perhaps it was a defiance whispered against fate. If life will not yield, neither will I. The child grew among dust and silence. Al-Awiyah was a place of poverty, of blood and loyalty. Men carried tribal scars on their wrists and grudges in their hearts. Honor was measured by how far a man would go to avenge a slight. There, cruelty was not an exception, it was survival. From the beginning, Saddam bore the marks of this harsh inheritance. His eyes, black and watchful, seemed older than his years. His small hand already carried the tattoo of his tribe. 3 dark blue dots burned into his skin. He belonged to a people hardened by drought, humiliation, and memory. Life offered no gentleness. Children worked the fields, herded sheep, stole when hunger gnawed too hard. In this small boy's world, tenderness was weakness, and obedience was enforced by the whip. Yet inside him, something stirred an instinct, not just to survive, but to control. He would not be broken like the others. Sometimes, when the evening wind moved through the reeds, he would stare toward the distant city of Tikrit, where lights shimmered like a promise. He could not yet name what he felt, but in his chest burned the first spark of defiance. From the mud and grief of Al-Awiyah, the boy who would become the butcher of Baghdad was learning his first lesson, that power was the only cure for pain. In the years that followed, Saddam's childhood drifted between 2 men, one who spoke of glory and one who knew only cruelty. His mother, unable to care for him, sent the boy to live with her brother, Khairallah Talfa, a retired army officer and proud Arab nationalist. Talfa was a man of sharp eyes and restless words, forever railing against the British who had once ruled Iraq. In his small house in Tikrit, the air was thick with stories of heroes who fought for Arab unity, of enemies who had betrayed the nation, of a future yet to be won. To a lonely child, those words were a fire. Saddam would sit at his uncle's feet, listening to every tale as if it was scripture. He heard that strength was the only virtue, that fear was the tool of the weak, that destiny belonged to those who dared seize it. Sometimes Talfa would place his hand on the boy's shoulder and say, "One day, you will lead men. One day, they will follow your will." It was the first time anyone had spoken to him like that, not as a burden, but as a seed of greatness. Talfa gave him his first gift, a small handgun, cold and heavy in the child's hand. For Saddam, It was not a weapon, it was a promise. But dreams, in Iraq, are fragile things. When Talfa was imprisoned for his part in a failed coup against the pro-British government, Saddam was sent back to his mother in Al-Awya. By then, she had remarried a man named Ibrahim Hassan, known in the village as Hassan the Liar. Where Talfa spoke of destiny, Hassan believed in domination. He was a man who ruled his home as if it were a battlefield. Every morning, Saddam woke to his shouts, the whip of leather against skin. "You son of a dog," Hassan would sneer. "I don't want you here." The boy was beaten for sleeping too long, beaten for not working fast enough, beaten for existing. He was forbidden to go to school. Instead, he was sent to steal goats, chickens, whatever could fill the house. And if he was caught, he would rather kill the animal than return it. In this small, suffocating world, his silence hardened into something sharp. Life in 1,940 seconds. Tikrit was ruled by codes older than law. Men carried daggers at their belts and pride like armor. An insult could spark a blood feud. A killing could be avenged 3 generations later. The villagers prayed in the mosque and plotted vengeance in the dark. Power was the language everyone understood, and cruelty was the dialect that survived. Saddam watched and learned. He learned that mercy made a man vulnerable, that lies could protect, that fear could command. The lessons of his uncle and his stepfather, one preaching purpose, the other practicing pain, began to fuse inside him, forming the iron of his future self. At 10 years old, when he heard that his uncle had been released from prison, Saddam fled the house before dawn. He walked for miles through the dust to Tikrit, barefoot, hungry, and unafraid. He never looked back. In his mind, the road from Al-Awya to Tikrit was not just an escape, it was an ascent. The beaten child was already dreaming of the day he would never bow to anyone again. When Saddam returned to live with his uncle, he was no longer the frightened child from Al-Awja. The bruises had faded, but something colder had taken their place, a quiet resolve that looked, even then, like destiny. Gairallah Talfa welcomed him back, as if reclaiming a lost apprentice. The uncle's home became a small kingdom of words and war stories. Maps of the Arab world hung beside the Quran. Evenings were spent in tobacco smoke and talk of revolution of the day. Iraq would rise free from British chains and corrupt kings. In those days, the streets of Tikrit trembled with unrest. British influence still clung to the army and the throne. But beneath it, the ground was shifting. Arab nationalism was no longer a dream whispered in coffee houses. It was a movement gathering like a storm. Radios carried the speeches of Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, the voice that made an entire generation believe the Arab world could be reborn. To the young Saddam, these words were not politics, they were prophecy. He began to see himself reflected in those visions, the strong man who bends history to his will, the leader who purges weakness with fire. His uncle fed those dreams, teaching him that violence was not a sin, but a tool. Mercy, Talfa said, is for those who have already won. Saddam practiced his lessons. In the alleys of Tikrit, he carried the small handgun his uncle had given him, spinning it in his hands as if it were part of his own body. Some said he threatened his school teachers with it. Others whispered that one night, after a street fight, a man was found dead and the boy disappeared until morning. No proof, only stories, but in Iraq, stories were more powerful than truth. The country itself was a mirror of the boy's rage, fractured, proud, and searching for identity. The monarchy tottered between the West and the will of its own people. Soviet pamphlets circulated secretly among students. Whispers of socialism and revolution crossed with the language of Arab pride. To the young Saddam, these ideas did not contradict, they united under a single creed. Strength. He learned about Stalin, the man who turned fear into empire. He studied Nasser, who transformed humiliation into pride. In his notebooks, Saddam copied quotes from both half the words about unity, half about power. Ideology became the armor that gave meaning to his anger. At school, his temper flared easily. He was thin, intense, and intolerant of insult. Once, a classmate mocked his provincial accent. Saddam struck him with a stone, leaving blood on the sand. Teachers called it violence. He called it respect. By the mid-1950s, Iraq was a nation seething beneath the surface. The young saw no future under the crown. The Ba'ath Party, the Renaissance Party, whispered promises of unity, socialism, and freedom from colonial hands. To most, it was a dream. To Saddam, it was a weapon. In 1957, at just 20 years old, he joined the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, not as a thinker or speaker, but as an enforcer. He came carrying the same pistol his uncle had once placed in his palm, now worn smooth by time and purpose. For the first time, Saddam's fury had found a flag to march under. His brutality had a cause, and his cause would soon find its battlefield. Baghdad, October 1959. The city pulsed like a living thing, markets alive with noise, soldiers at every corner, rumors carried in the heat like smoke. Beneath the calm surface, Iraq was a nation trembling on the edge. Prime Minister Abdul Karim Qasim ruled from the heart of the capital, a man who had once been hailed as a liberator. But freedom in Iraq had never stayed pure for long. In the narrow rooms and shaded cafes, secret meetings took place. The Ba'ath Party, still an underground movement, whispered of a new Iraq, one led not by compromise but by will. In their vision, socialism would cleanse corruption, Arab unity would erase weakness, and power would belong to those who dared seize it. To many, they were dreamers. To Saddam, they were destiny's hand. He was 22, then thin, sharp-eyed, impatient. His pistol, polished to a dull silver, was the only thing he trusted. When word spread that Qasim was to be assassinated, Saddam volunteered without hesitation. He was not the leader of the plot, but he moved among them like one already touched by legend. The plan was simple: ambush the Prime Minister's motorcade on Baghdad's busiest street, Rashid Street, where the crowds would hide the gunmen. But plans, in Iraq, had a way of bleeding. As Qasim's car approached, the young conspirators waited in the shadows. The smell of gasoline, dust, and fear hung thick in the air. One of them signaled too early. Chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the noise of the city. Pedestrians screamed and scattered. Qasim's driver slumped over the wheel, shot dead. The Prime Minister, hit in the arm and shoulder, survived. Saddam fired his rounds, the recoil stinging his arm. A bullet tore into his leg, throwing him into the gutter. For a moment, he lay in the dirt, staring up at a sky that seemed to hold its breath. Then he crawled away, bleeding, vanishing into the maze of alleys that wrapped around the old city. When the shooting stopped, Baghdad's streets were littered with the bodies of conspirators and bystanders alike. Within hours, the regime struck back. Arrests swept through the capital. Dozens were executed. But Saddam, the wounded one, the young man who had fled with a bullet still inside his flesh, escaped. He reached the countryside first, then crossed into Syria. There, among the Ba'ath networks, the story of his survival began to grow. Some said he dug the bullet from his leg with a penknife. Others claimed he walked on the wound for days without flinching. None of it could be proven, but none of it needed to be. In the streets of Damascus, they began to whisper his name, Saddam, the fighter who defied death. His legend had begun, born not from victory, but from failure. The Cold War had reached Iraq's borders by then. The United States and the Soviet Union each sought to shape the country's future. While Qasim leaned toward Moscow, the Ba'athists courted both ideologies, socialism wrapped in Arab pride. To Western eyes, they were radicals. To themselves, they were architects of destiny. For Saddam, exile became education. Wounded, hidden, and burning with humiliation, he studied how revolutions survived. He watched how the Soviets turned defeat into discipline, and he vowed that next time, he would not run, others would. In that wound, in that flight through the desert night, a new Saddam was born, the one who believed that failure was only the first step toward power. Cairo, 1960. The city moved like a song, restless, sunlit, alive with the voices of a generation that believed history could be rewritten. Street vendors shouted beside students in pressed shirts. The smell of tobacco, dust, and ambition filled the air. Here, in the heart of Egypt's revolution, the young exile from Iraq found his second birth. Saddam arrived, carrying little but his scar, his pistol, and the conviction that he had survived for a reason. Iraq was behind him, the heat of Al-Auja, the blood of Rashid Street, yet in Cairo he discovered something larger than vengeance. Here, under the shadow of President Gamal Abdel Nasser, Arab nationalism had become a faith. Nasser's Egypt was the dream of every restless Arab youth, proud, independent, defiant against the West. His speeches rolled across radios like thunder, promising dignity to all who had once bowed their heads. For Saddam, these were not just words, they were scripture. He walked the same streets as the students who had fought the British, studied in the same halls where revolutions had been born. At the University of Cairo, he enrolled in the law faculty. The irony was sharp. A man who once lived by the gun, now studying the language of justice. But for Saddam, law was not morality, it was structure, the architecture of control. He read about Roman codes and Soviet constitutions, marking passages on authority and obedience. Power, he realized, did not only belong to the strong, it belonged to those who understood how to legitimize strength. He was an outsider, a foreigner with a heavy accent and a wary gaze. Yet he moved among Egypt's Ba'athists, Syrian exiles, and idealists with growing ease. At night, in the cafes along the Nile, they spoke of a single Arab nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Gulf. One flag, one army, one destiny. Saddam listened more than he spoke, absorbing everything like a man sharpening a blade in silence. Egypt changed him. The boy who once learned cruelty from survival began to see power as something that could be designed, not just seized. He studied Nasser's image, his charisma, his calculated gestures, his ability to make millions believe. Leadership, Saddam understood, was theater. Control required performance. Yet even in Cairo's modern rhythm, he remained the son of the desert. Beneath the student's suit and polished shoes, his old anger still smoldered. He carried within him the quiet certainty that one day he would return not as the hunted, but as the hunter. By 1963, the winds of Iraq were shifting again. Qasim's rule had crumbled, toppled by a coalition that included the Ba'ath. The gates of Baghdad were open, and for the exiles, the call of home was irresistible. When Saddam boarded the train north, he was no longer the wounded boy who had crawled through Baghdad's alleys. He was something new, disciplined, patient, and convinced that his destiny lay not in survival, but in command. The desert had taught him to endure. Egypt had taught him to dream. Now, returning to Iraq, he was ready to turn both lessons into power. Baghdad, 1964. The city was quieter now, the air heavy with suspicion. The Ba'ath party had risen, stumbled, and fallen again in the same breath. Their coup had failed, and the dream of unity lay broken. For Saddam, it was another turn in a life already marked by exile and survival. He was caught, tried, and sent to prison, a place meant to crush men. Instead, it refined him. The cell was small and airless, its walls sweating with dust and heat. At night, the screams of beaten prisoners echoed down the corridors like prayers for mercy that would never come. But Saddam was not afraid. He had seen fear before. Now he studied it. He watched how men broke, how hunger loosened loyalty, how silence spread like infection. In that darkness, he began to build something, not an escape plan at first, but a system. He organized the other Ba'athist inmates, creating routines, discipline, rules. Every morning, they saluted one another as if still soldiers of the cause. Those who faltered were punished, not by the guards, but by Saddam himself. Even in chains, he practiced control. Books became his companions and his weapons. The prison library, sparse and half-broken, offered the strangest of teachers, the biographies of Stalin, Hitler, and Napoleon. He read them all, not with admiration alone, but with analysis, marking passages about loyalty, propaganda, and fear. He underlined the sentences where leaders turned cruelty into order. From Stalin, he learned that terror could be methodical, not rage, but ritual. From Hitler, that charisma was as powerful as armies. From Napoleon, that destiny favored the bold. To his fellow prisoners, he began to quote them as if they were scripture. He spoke of will, unity, and obedience, words that made men straighten their backs in the half-light of the cell. Sometimes, he would pace the narrow room, imagining Iraq as a chessboard. The pieces were people, soldiers, party men, peasants. He saw how a nation could be ruled by fear and still call it loyalty. It was here, among rats and rust, that Saddam's true education began. His body weakened, but his mind hardened. He kept notes on scraps of paper, sketching the outlines of a future government who would control what, how messages would flow, how informants would report. Even in confinement, he was building an empire in miniature. By 1966, fortune shifted again. Loyalists within the Ba'ath network bribed guards and arranged his escape. One humid night, Saddam slipped through a laundry truck and vanished into the dark streets. Some say he left wearing a stolen uniform. Others claim he simply walked out, unnoticed. However it happened, he was free and no longer the same man who had entered. The years in prison had carved him into something colder, more deliberate. He had learned patience, the tyrant's most dangerous gift. When he rejoined the Ba'ath underground, his rise was swift. He became deputy secretary of the regional command, his influence spreading like oil through dry sand. He spoke softly now, but every word carried weight. The others began to look at him, not as a comrade, but as a commander. The cell had failed to contain him. It had forged him. In that narrow room of stone and silence, Saddam Hussein discovered what power truly was, the ability to make men obey even when the door is locked. Baghdad, 1968. The air trembled with the sound of engines and gunfire, not from war, but from another coup. Iraq had grown used to revolutions the way the desert grows used to wind, sudden, fierce, and never the last. This one, though, would not fade. The Ba'ath Party had returned, and this time, it meant to stay. Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, a heavy man with a soldier's bearing and cautious eyes, took the presidency. But behind him, in the half-shadow of every meeting and every decree, stood a younger man, quiet, sharp, and tireless. His name was Saddam Hussein. He had learned patience in prison, and now he used it like a weapon. As al-Bakr spoke to the cameras, Saddam was already reorganizing the machinery of power, invisible gears of control that would soon turn faster than any law. He became deputy to the president and head of internal security, a position more powerful than the title itself. The first months were full of promises, reform, prosperity, unity. But under the surface, the old habits of fear began to return. Saddam created the Mukhabarat, the secret police force that would become the eyes and ears of the regime. Its members swore loyalty not to Iraq, but to him. In dimly lit offices across Baghdad, files began to multiply: names, addresses, whispers. Informants crept into every ministry, school, and neighborhood. A careless joke, a wrong word, a delayed salute, all could end in a midnight knock on the door. Saddam understood that control was not built by ideology, but by uncertainty. When people fear everyone, they obey anyone. He moved quietly through the corridors of government, removing those who doubted, rewarding those who served without question. Rivals disappeared in polite appointments, a sudden transfer, a car accident, a resignation followed by silence. His signature appeared on few documents, but his hand was in everything. Inside the Ministry of the Interior, interrogation rooms multiplied like fungus in the dark. The walls were painted the color of ash, the air thick with sweat and cigarette smoke. Men entered shouting loyalty. They left whispering confessions. Fear was the new currency, and Saddam controlled the mint. At party headquarters, new members stood in rows to swear allegiance not only to the Ba'ath, but to the man who watched from the back of the room. Eyes steady, expression unreadable. He listened more than he spoke. He took notes on who hesitated before saying his name. Even al-Bakr, the official leader, began to sense the shift. The older man was president in title, but Saddam had the keys to the prisons, to the reports, to the hearts of those who feared him. He began visiting soldiers in their barracks, peasants in their villages, and clerks in their offices, promising roads, wages, dignity. Yet behind each handshake trailed the invisible thread of surveillance. The people saw a man of action. The party saw an enforcer. Saddam saw a kingdom in the making. By the early 1972, his shadow reached everywhere, from the radio studios to the torture chambers, from the council halls to the mosques. He did not yet wear the crown, but the throne was already molded to his shape. In the quiet after the coup, Iraq slept under a new kind of silence. Not the silence of peace, but of listening. Somewhere, always, someone was listening. And at the center of it all sat Saddam Hussein, the man who ruled first through whispers, then through fear. The 1970 seconds arrived like sunlight after a long storm. Iraq seemed reborn, its cities swelling with cranes, its streets humming with confidence. Newspapers spoke of progress, radios sang of the new Iraq, and everywhere, the same name echoed beneath the music of triumph: Saddam Hussein. The Ba'ath government had nationalized Iraq's oil industry, seizing control from Western companies. Overnight, the nation's wealth multiplied. Oil flowed from the ground like molten gold, and so did promises. Schools were built, hospitals gleamed white in the desert light, and highways stretched across the land where dust roads once wound like scars. On paper, Iraq was becoming a modern state. Illiteracy campaigns reached every village. Education became free and attendance mandatory. Women entered universities in numbers unseen before. Public housing rose for the poor. Salaries grew, and Baghdad glowed at night like a city finally catching up to its dreams. And at the center of it, all smiling, firm, omnipresent, was Saddam. Though still officially the deputy, he was the architect behind every ribbon cut, every project praised. His photographs began to appear in classrooms, on government walls, in factories. To the people, he seemed the embodiment of progress itself, the man who had pulled Iraq from the mud into the age of steel. But progress, under his hand, was never just prosperity. It was choreography. Behind every new hospital stood soldiers in plain clothes. In the classrooms where children learned to read, they also learned to recite loyalty. Textbooks replaced dates with slogans. Teachers spoke of Father Saddam as though he had built the Tigris himself. The oil boom funded not only education and roads, but surveillance and weapons. A portion of every dinar went to expanding the mukhabarat, building prisons disguised as administrative offices, and purchasing tanks and aircraft from both East and West. Saddam played Moscow and Washington against each other, feeding off their rivalry like a merchant of power. Ordinary Iraqis saw their lives improve, and so they learned not to question. Fear had changed shape. It was no longer a fist. It was a smile on a billboard, a life too good to risk losing. At party meetings, al-Bakr still sat at the head of the table, but everyone's eyes drifted towards Saddam. The younger man spoke softly, but his words carried finality. The old president, weary and ailing, began to retreat into silence. Sometimes, he would sign decrees without reading them, knowing already whose hand had written them. Saddam began cultivating his myth. He visited schools and factories, shaking hands, calling workers brothers. Cameras followed him as he embraced children, inspected crops, or stood atop dams like a guardian of progress. Yet these gestures were rehearsed, repeated, perfected the rituals of a man building not merely a nation but a legend. At night, as the city glowed with oil money, darker lights flickered behind palace walls. The mukhabarat's cars moved silently through the streets, picking up men whose only crime was doubt. The next morning, the newspapers spoke only of harvests and poetry. To the world, Iraq was a success story, the Arab model of modernity, but within its shining surface, the foundations of fear had already set like concrete. By the end of the decade, the transformation was complete. Iraq was richer, prouder, and utterly dependent on one man's image. And that man, standing in the soft shadow of the aging al-Bakr, was ready to step fully into the light. Baghdad, July 1979. The sun rose hard and white over the Tigris, and a strange stillness hung in the air. Rumor had been moving through the city for weeks that the old man, al-Bakr, was stepping down, and that his quiet deputy was ready to take the throne he had already ruled in shadow. On July 16, the announcement came. Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr had resigned for health reasons. Within hours, Saddam Hussein was proclaimed President of the Republic of Iraq. He accepted the position in a calm voice, but his eyes gleamed with something colder than triumph. He had been waiting for this moment since the dust roads of Al-Auja, and he knew that power, once taken, must be consecrated in blood. 5 days later, he summoned the Ba'ath Party leadership, some 250 men, to a special assembly. The hall was grand, the air thick with the smell of tobacco and fear. Cameras were positioned discreetly, lights adjusted. This was not merely a meeting, it was a performance. Saddam took the podium with his usual composure. His mustache was trimmed, his suit immaculate, his voice low but sharp as a blade. He began with words of loyalty and unity, thanking his comrades for their service. Then, his tone shifted. He said a plot had been uncovered, a conspiracy within the party itself, a betrayal from within their sacred house. Murmurs swept the room. Eyes darted from man to man. Saddam's expression did not change. He raised a sheet of paper. From the front row, an informant, trembling, voice cracking, began to read aloud the list of names. 68 men, one by one. Each name landed like a bullet. As it was read, guards moved forward, dragging the accused from their seats. The sound of boots and sobbing filled the hall. Some pleaded, others fainted. One man tried to flee and was beaten to the floor. Saddam watched it all without blinking. When the reading ended, he thanked the informant, then turned to the remaining men. "You have witnessed the betrayal," he said, "and you will witness justice." Outside, trucks waited to carry away the condemned. Within days, 22 of them were executed, many by their own colleagues, forced to prove their loyalty. The entire purge was filmed and later shown across the nation. Iraq watched in horrified silence as ministers, generals, and party members were dragged from the hall. The message was unmistakable. No one is untouchable. Fear had become theater rehearsed, perfected, performed. Saddam understood that terror, to endure, must be made visible. It had to be ritualized, turned into a spectacle that ordinary people would watch, whisper about, and internalize. The executions were not only punishment, they were pedagogy. They taught Iraqis to flinch at the sound of his name and to applaud while trembling. After the purge, the party swore new oaths of allegiance not to the Ba'ath, but to Saddam personally. In the ministries, portraits of al-Bakr were quietly removed. In their place appeared Saddam's face, stern, paternal, omnipresent. Even the air on Baghdad's streets seemed to shift. People spoke more softly. Jokes vanished. Every whisper was measured against survival. In less than a week, Saddam Hussein had transformed from vice president to absolute ruler, not through election, not through consent, but through choreography. He had staged fear itself and made a nation watch. The performance was complete, and in its silence, power became absolute. By the early 1982, Saddam Hussein no longer ruled Iraq. He was Iraq. His face watched from every classroom, every office, every newspaper. In the morning, the radio spoke his name. At night, the television showed his smile. To praise him was safety. To forget him was danger. He cultivated his image like a sculptor shaping marble. Always the same posture, upright, shoulders square, chin raised, the mustache trimmed, the hair dyed jet black, never a strand out of place. He wore tailored suits for cameras and military uniforms for parades. A man who could appear as both father and warrior, scholar and soldier, saint and sword. In public, he was charming and articulate, speaking in calm, rhythmic tones that evoked both poetry and command. But behind the charm lived a man possessed by suspicion. He trusted no one, not aides, not generals, not even family. Every room he entered was swept for bugs, every meal tested for poison. His obsession with hygiene bordered on ritual. Before meetings, visitors were ordered to strip to their underwear. Their clothes were washed, ironed, and x-rayed. They were forced to wash their hands in disinfectant before shaking his. He never ate food that had not been tested twice. His favorite drink, Portuguese Mateus rosé wine, was never poured in public, so the illusion of his piousness would remain intact. Each of his 20 palaces was fully staffed year-round, with fresh meals prepared daily, though he might not visit for months. The kitchens never rested, for no one could know where he would sleep. He moved constantly from one mansion to another, sometimes changing location 3 times in a night. His guards never knew his route until the moment he left. To protect him, dozens of body doubles were trained to mimic his walk, his gestures, even the way he lit a cigar. This constant motion was not luxury. It was fear disguised as control. But Saddam understood that in the Middle East, power had to appear divine. Like ancient caliphs or pharaohs, he blurred the line between ruler and myth. Billboards declared him the guardian of the nation, the builder of civilization. School children began each day with a pledge to him, their voices rising like prayer. He wrote novels and poems under pseudonyms, weaving his own mythology into Iraq's culture. Artists painted him as a shepherd among his people, a soldier in golden armor, a man anointed by destiny. The cult of Saddam was no longer propaganda, it was faith. At home, his life was no less calculated. He married his cousin Sajida, daughter of his uncle, Kerala Talfa, the same uncle who had once given him a gun and a dream. They had 5 children, 2 sons, Uday and Qusay, and 3 daughters, Regard, Rana, and Hala. In public, they were the perfect family symbols of unity and tradition. In private, it was a kingdom of fear. Saddam ruled his household as he ruled his nation, through loyalty, suspicion, and absolute control. His sons inherited his appetite for power, but none of his restraint. Uday, the elder, was violent and unpredictable, a prince who believed himself invincible. Qusay was colder, quieter, but equally dangerous. Both were given positions of influence, Uday in the press and sport, Qusay in security. Their rise signaled the beginning of a dynasty, one built not on bloodlines alone, but on terror. By now, Saddam's voice carried farther than the Tigris. He had remade Iraq in his image, disciplined, paranoid, magnificent, and cruel. Ministers spoke his words before he did. Generals saluted his portraits as if they were alive. He had conquered the country not with war, but with illusion, a performance so total that even fear began to look like devotion. And as the world beyond Iraq watched, uncertain whether to admire or despise him, Saddam Hussein stood at the height of his power, a man who had turned himself into a myth, and a myth that no one dared question. September 1980, the desert wind blew eastward, carrying the scent of dust and fuel. Along Iraq's border, tanks gathered like sleeping beasts, their cannons aimed toward Iran. On Saddam Hussein's desk lay the map of 2 nations and a single belief, that destiny had chosen him to lead the Arabs against Persia. The decision was his alone. Convinced that Iran's revolution had left it weak and leaderless, Saddam saw opportunity. "It will take 1 week," he told his generals. "We will march to Tehran as liberators." At dawn, the guns opened. Columns of Iraqi armor crossed the border, tearing through the fields of Khuzestan. The invasion began with parades of victory drums, flags, speeches, but within days, the mirage began to fade. Iran did not crumble, it ignited. Ayatollah Khomeini, frail but unyielding, called for a holy defense. Across the border, thousands of volunteers, old men, students, even children took up arms, carrying Qurans in one hand and rifles in the other. The war Saddam expected to win in a week stretched into years of mud, blood, and ruin. By 1982, the front lines had frozen into a landscape of death. Trench warfare, the kind the world thought had died in 1918, returned to life on the burning plains. The air was thick with cordite and decay. Soldiers slept among corpses, drank from poisoned wells, and waited for orders that never came. Iraq bombed cities. Iran answered with waves of human sacrifice. The battlefields were filled with boys too young to shave, wearing plastic keys around their necks, symbols of the paradise they were promised. The ground itself seemed to devour them. When desperation set in, Saddam unleashed weapons that defied all laws of war. Mustard gas, sarin, and other chemical agents fell upon Iranian troops like invisible rain. The dead lay twisted where they stood, faces frozen in the act of breathing. Those who survived coughed blood for years. But the worst came not on the front lines, but in the north, in the Kurdish town of Halabja. It was March 1988. The war was ending, but Saddam's vengeance was not. Accusing the Kurds of aiding Iran, he ordered the bombing of their villages. When the planes came, the people ran for the fields, mothers clutching babies, old men pulling carts. They thought it was just another air raid. Then the sky began to fall. Yellow clouds rolled through the streets, silent and heavy. Birds dropped from the air. The gas crept into lungs, eyes, skin. In minutes, the town was still. Photographers who arrived later found scenes too terrible for language. Entire families huddled together, faces blue, hands reaching toward each other. A boy lay beside his dog, both dead. A mother, her arms locked around an infant who had stopped crying mid-breath. An Iranian journalist, Kaveh Golestan, later wrote, "It was life frozen. Life had stopped, like a film stuck on one frame, a new kind of death. 5,000 died that day. 10,000 more were left scarred or blind. Years later, survivors still coughed up the memory invisible, unending. When the war finally ended in August 1988, there was no victory to claim. 1 million men were dead or missing. Both nations were shattered. Iraq's cities stood hollow, its economy drained, its young generation buried beneath the sand. Yet Saddam called it triumph. He appeared on television, saluting, smiling, declaring that Iraq had defended Arab honor. The people clapped, because that was what survival required. But beneath the applause lay silence, the silence of a generation devoured by one man's delusion. The war had not reshaped borders. It had only redrawn the boundaries of human suffering. And in that silence, Saddam prepared for what he would call his next great mission. The war ended, but Iraq did not heal. The cities were scarred, the fields poisoned, and the dead uncounted. What had begun as a promise of glory ended as silence, a silence heavy with ruin. The soldiers who returned found no victory parades, only ration lines and empty wallets. A generation had been spent, and for what? Saddam Hussein stood before his nation, like a man surveying the ruins of his own dream. The treasury was bankrupt. The price of oil had collapsed. Billions in debt hung over Iraq's head like a storm. The country owed money to nearly everyone, especially Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, who had bankrolled his war against Iran. But gratitude was never Saddam's instinct. He saw their wealth as an insult, their prosperity as theft. Iraq, he argued, had bled for the Arab world. While others counted their profits, Iraq had fought the Persians. And now, he said, the Arabs owed him repayment. In 1990, the debt crisis deepened. Iraq asked OPEC to raise oil prices to stabilize its shattered economy. Kuwait refused and, worse, continued to overproduce oil, driving prices lower. To Saddam, it was treachery. In private meetings, he raged that Kuwait was stealing Iraq's future. He accused them of slant, drilling into Iraqi oil fields, and demanded billions in compensation. But beneath the fury lay desperation. Iraq's war machine was too large to dismantle, too hungry to feed. Factories stood idle, men jobless, and the army restless. The pride that had carried the country through 8 years of war now curdled into humiliation. Saddam looked south. Kuwait was small, rich, and defenseless. He saw not a neighbor, but a solution. Publicly, he framed his anger as justice, claiming Kuwait was historically part of Iraq, carved away by British hands during colonial rule. He began to speak not as a debtor, but as a liberator. His propaganda machine thundered that Kuwait was exploiting the Iraqi people, that the nation's dignity demanded action. It was an old trick, greed draped in the colors of nationalism. In July 1990, Saddam summoned the US ambassador, April Glaspie, to the Republican Palace. The meeting was tense, recorded, and later infamous. He spoke of Kuwait's betrayal, of economic warfare. Glaspie replied that America had no opinion on Arab border disputes, a phrase Saddam took as permission. Weeks later, the desert trembled again. On the 2nd of August 1990, before dawn, Iraqi tanks crossed the Kuwaiti border. Within 6 hours, They reached Kuwait City. The invasion was swift, precise, and brutal. Government buildings fell, the emir fled, and Saddam declared the country annexed as Iraq's 19th province. Baghdad erupted in celebration. State television showed cheering crowds and soldiers draped in flags. Saddam appeared in military uniform, waving to the cameras, declaring that Kuwait has returned to the motherland. But beyond Iraq's borders, the world's reaction was immediate and furious. The United Nations condemned the invasion. Arab allies recoiled in horror. Economic sanctions fell like iron gates. To the global community, this was not liberation, it was conquest. Saddam, however, mistook the world's outrage for fear. He believed that just as the Arab world had once rallied to him against Iran, they would now stand behind him again. He was wrong. The man who had once styled himself the defender of Arab pride had become its thief, a king standing atop ashes, blinded by his own reflection. January 1991. The night sky above Baghdad burned with color tracer fire, rockets, and the white bloom of explosions. Operation Desert Storm had begun. For the first time in modern history, the world watched a war live on television. The coalition against Iraq, 35 nations led by the United States, unleashed a storm of precision bombs and satellite-guided destruction. Inside his palace, Saddam Hussein stood before the cameras, defiant as ever. He called it the mother of all battles. He promised that Iraq would prevail, that the desert would swallow the invaders. Outside, the people huddled in basements as the sky thundered above them. The first wave of bombing targeted air defenses, power stations, bridges, and communication centers. Baghdad's skyline flickered like a dying circuit. Families clung to each other as glass shattered, and the city went dark. Even the ground seemed to hum with the weight of distant fire. Saddam's army, once the pride of the Arab world, was outmatched. American stealth bombers erased divisions before they could move. Coalition forces advanced from Saudi Arabia, cutting through Iraqi defenses with overwhelming force. Within weeks, the Iraqi army began to disintegrate not from lack of courage, but from the impossibility of resistance. By February, the desert was filled with retreating Iraqi soldiers. The highway north from Kuwait City became a graveyard of burning vehicles, tanks, trucks, and buses lined in endless rows. Coalition aircraft struck the columns relentlessly. It would later be called the Highway of Death. Thousands of Iraqi conscripts, many barely 18, were killed as they fled. Saddam watched from Baghdad and smiled for the cameras. He declared that Iraq had punched a hole in the myth of American superiority. His speeches were aired daily, his image still unshaken. But in the homes beneath the rubble, Iraqis no longer believed. They survived by pretending to. The war lasted only 42 days. When the ceasefire was announced, Iraq had lost everything, its army crippled, its infrastructure shattered, its people exhausted. Yet Saddam called it a victory. On state television, he appeared in uniform, saluting the nation. "We have stood firm against the world," he proclaimed. "History will remember our courage." It was pride after humiliation, the stubbornness of a man who could not imagine himself defeated. But even as the guns fell silent, Iraq's wounds deepened. In the south, the Shia population rose up, believing the Americans would support them. In the north, the Kurds did the same. Both rebellions were crushed with merciless precision. Helicopters strafed towns, prisons overflowed. The same regime that had failed to protect its borders turned its weapons inward. By the summer of 1991, Iraq was sealed off from the world. United Nations sanctions cut off trade and medicine. Children died in hospitals for lack of antibiotics. Markets stood bare. Electricity came and went like memory. Still, Saddam's portraits hung high. His speeches filled the airwaves, promising that Iraq's suffering was a test, not a punishment. He turned humiliation into mythology, the idea that Iraq had not lost, but merely endured. In the ruins of Baghdad, mothers whispered prayers while painting walls black for mourning. Fathers buried their sons without flags, only silence. And above them all, on the evening news, the same voice spoke, calm and unbroken, as if nothing had changed. Saddam Hussein had survived. For him, survival itself was victory. The 1,990 seconds were a long dusk over Iraq, a decade where the lights dimmed slowly, and the echoes of power outlasted its substance. The world had turned away. The sanctions sealed the borders, strangling trade and medicine. Time itself seemed to thicken, as if Iraq had been trapped in a waiting room between wars. For Saddam Hussein, the war had never truly ended. It had merely shifted inward. He ruled a country of ghosts, men broken by war, women queuing for flour, children growing up knowing only rations and portraits of their leader. Yet through the hunger and decay, his image endured, sharp, smiling, eternal. Sanctions drained the nation's lifeblood, but not his wealth. While the people bartered bread for soap, the ruling family thrived in secret palaces. Smuggled oil and black market deals filled the coffers of Saddam's inner circle. The gap between ruler and ruled widened until it became a chasm, and in that chasm roamed his sons, Uday and Qusay. Uday, the eldest, was chaos incarnate. Loud, violent, and unpredictable, he used his father's name as both shield and weapon. He stormed through Baghdad's nights in convoys of black Mercedes, firing into the air, abducting anyone who dared cross him. His cruelty was legend. When he killed his father's personal valet and close friend at a party in 1988, even Saddam recoiled. Yet instead of punishment, Uday was exiled briefly to Switzerland, only to return more untouchable than before. He controlled Iraq's media, turning television into a shrine to himself. He ran the National Olympic Committee as a private torture chamber. Athletes who failed to win were beaten, their feet crushed, their families threatened. His mansion was a carnival of indulgence. Imported cars, gold-plated rifles, European wine, and women taken as tribute. Qusay was different, colder, quieter, meticulous. He commanded the Republican Guard and the Special Security Organization, the pillars of Saddam's rule. Where Uday was flame, Qusay was ice. He spoke little, but everyone feared him more. His word decided who lived, who vanished. For their father, the sons were mirrors of his own divided soul, chaos and control, excess and order. He loved them both and trusted neither. Each was a piece of him he could not destroy. Meanwhile, the country decayed. Power plants rusted, hospitals darkened, and markets filled with whispers. People learned to survive by trading silence. The once proud middle class withered into despair. Teachers sold cigarettes. Engineers drove taxis. Children drew bombs and tanks in their notebooks because they had never known peace. At the top, Saddam's paranoia deepened. He no longer trusted his generals. He shuffled them constantly, promoting loyal mediocrity over competence. He built new bunkers beneath palaces, stocked with food, water, and books of his speeches. He surrounded himself with doubles, never sleeping twice in the same room. Every few months, he staged a public display parades, speeches, grand awards, as if to convince himself that the machinery of glory still worked. State television showed him feeding birds, reading poetry, stroking the heads of orphans. But his eyes were elsewhere, searching the horizon for threats that might not yet exist. And beyond that horizon, the world was watching again. In 2001, the towers fell in New York. The dust of one empire stirred the wrath of another. The United States turned its gaze once more toward the old villain, the defiant ruler who had survived bombs, sanctions, and history itself. To Washington, Saddam Hussein became a ghost that refused to fade, the lingering embodiment of danger in a world craving order. For him, it was both a curse and an invitation. As night settled over Baghdad, the old strongman stood once more in the glare of global light. But this time, it was not the radiance of power. It was the dawn of his reckoning. March 2003. Baghdad was quiet in the days before the storm, the kind of silence that comes when a nation already knows its fate. American tanks massed in Kuwait, bombers waited in the dark, and the world held its breath. Inside his palace, Saddam Hussein prepared for the war he swore would never come. He refused to flee. He told his generals, "I am Iraq. If I fall, so does the nation." It was not courage. Not anymore, it was delusion turned into ritual. On the night of March 19, the first bombs fell. They struck Baghdad like thunder without rain. The sky turned orange, and the earth trembled as if the city itself were gasping for air. The invasion that followed moved with surgical precision and impossible speed. Within 3 weeks, American troops reached the capital. Saddam's armies collapsed, his soldiers abandoning tanks for civilian clothes. The statues that once stood like gods in city squares were pulled down by cheering crowds. The world watched live as bronze idols of his face fell, ropes tightening around their necks, the end of an empire collapsing in dust. But the man himself was gone. For months, he vanished into rumor, one day in Tigris, another in Samarra, then somewhere near the Syrian border. His sons, Uday and Qusay, were hunted and killed in July. The empire of fear was breaking apart piece by piece. Then, on the 13th of December 2003, the hunt ended. Near his hometown of Ad-Dor, American soldiers found a small underground shelter, a hole barely large enough for a man to breathe. Inside, unshaven and disoriented, was the former ruler of Iraq. The man who once commanded armies and built palaces of marble now emerged from the dirt, holding nothing but a pistol and a loaf of bread. He looked up at the soldiers and asked, almost softly, "I am Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq. I want to negotiate." But there was nothing left to negotiate. The image of his capture spread across the world, a man pulled from a hole in the ground, blinking against the light he had long denied others. The myth cracked. The god had become a fugitive, the lion reduced to a shadow. In captivity, he tried to preserve the last fragments of dignity. He demanded cigarettes, dictated letters, and lectured his guards on Arab history. Sometimes he wept while praying. Sometimes he laughed without reason. The man who had once made others tremble now spoke to the walls. His trial began in 2005, a spectacle and a reckoning. Before the court, he denied everything. He called himself a patriot, not a tyrant. He claimed the massacres were lies, the war crimes inventions. "I am the son of Iraq," he said. "If you kill me, you kill yourselves." But history had already spoken. Witnesses came forward, mothers from Halabja, soldiers who had buried the dead. The weight of silence became testimony. On the 30th of December, 2006, at dawn, Saddam Hussein was led to the gallows in Camp Justice. The air was cold. The lights flickered. He refused the hood. He muttered prayers, and before the trap opened, he said, "God is great. The nation will live on." The rope snapped, and with it ended the life of a man who had tried to bind a country to his will. Outside, Baghdad was neither joyful nor at peace, only weary. The people did not celebrate. They watched the news in silence, as if seeing the end of a nightmare they could not yet wake from. The body was buried in Al-Auja, his birthplace, the same soil that had once birthed the dream of domination. The circle had closed. And yet, even in death, the question lingered like smoke over the ruins he left behind. What makes a man believe he is destiny itself? Perhaps it is fear of being ordinary, forgotten. Or perhaps it is the oldest illusion of all that power can fill the space where a soul should be. In the end, the butcher of Baghdad was not defeated by armies or politics, but by the emptiness within him, the silence that no anthem, no monument, no terror could ever drown.